Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming today. Just fair warning, I have a little bit of a cold, so bear with me. So we have a delightful, if not also slightly disturbing program ahead, featuring 8 short silent film comedies made between the years 1903 and 1914, all of which thematize women doing eccentric and oftentimes violent things with their bodies in order to provoke laughter. Just a few words about the film prints themselves. Charlie mentioned this. All of the films you're about to see will be projected on 35 millimeter with live piano accompaniment by Laura Silderberg, who we're very lucky to have playing for us today. The total running time of the program is about 88 minutes. The prints you'll see come from far and wide, 3 from the British Film Institute, 1 from the Harvard Film Archive, and 4 from the Desmet collection of the I Film Institute in the Netherlands. And we've divided the program into 2 parts. So in the first part, you'll see the 3 British films from the BFI and the 1 American film from the Harvard Film Archive. And in the second part, you'll see 2 French films, 1 Italian, and 1 German comedy, all of which come from the Desmet collection at the I. And I'm going to say a few words about the American and British films now, and then I'll give a separate introduction later for the 4 films from the continent in between the screenings. So the first film in the lineup is called Daisy Doodad's Dial, and it's a British film from 1914 made by an expat American screen actress, Florence Turner. And the film is really rather difficult to describe. I know of actually no other film quite like it. Daisy Doodad's Dial depicts the plight of a bored housewife who dreams of competing in an amateur face-making competition. She becomes completely obsessed with rehearsing her funny face-making in public, eventually getting herself arrested for disturbing the peace when she grimaces head-on at a police officer. Daisy wears her funny faces like a mask, and a lot of the comedic tension in the film comes from the conceal and reveal between her everyday performance of femininity and her compulsive rehearsals of her spastic facial elasticity. And the film actually stars its director and producer, Florence Turner, who was actually one of America's first movie stars back in 1908, known as the Vitagraph Girl. She was a lead actress for the Vitagraph Company. And she broke onto the scene alongside the Biograph Girl, who was named Florence Lawrence, and the Thanhauser Girl, who was named Florence Labadie. So I guess if you wanted to be a movie star circa 1908, it was helpful to be named Florence. But this is Florence Turner's actually only directorial credit, but one of over a dozen films that she produced in the UK through her independent company, Florence Turner Productions, including classics like Far from the Madding Crowd. And Florence Turner was an extremely versatile performer. She appeared in hundreds of roles across every possible genre of filmmaking throughout her career, from 1907 to 1943. From an early film adaptation of Dante's character Francesca da Rimini to the role of Buster Keaton's elderly mother in the 1927 silent film College, which some of you might have seen. Oops. So given Turner's extreme versatility, it's interesting that her one self-directed role would so strongly thematize the issue of mimicry. And she was also quite famous for her facial mimicry performances in her vaudeville and music hall acts. And in this film, Daisy seems to absorb all of the contingencies and uncertainties of the patriarchal world around her, and to express these contingencies through the bizarre facial contortions that play out across her face. And I won't give anything away, I don't want to spoil any of the surprises, but the final scene is especially haunting, and it involves a procession of disembodied close-ups of Daisy's face-making that torment her while she tries to sleep in her bedroom. So if not a genre comedy, Daisy Doodad's Dial is certainly a gendered comedy that provokes us to meditate on how humorous tropes get enlisted to negotiate both social and political transitions stemming from the collapse of gendered public and private spheres, as well as aesthetic transitions in filmmaking technique. So the second film on deck is a short trick film from 1903 titled Mary Jane's Mishap, which is about a slovenly British maid who accidentally blows herself up while attempting to light a hearth fire with paraffin. She spontaneously combusts, explodes out of the chimney, rains down over the village skyline in dismembered bodily pieces, and like Daisy Doodad, returns again at the end as a translucent specter. Among other things, Mary Jane's mishap raises serious questions about the extent to which audiences in 1903 found it pleasurable to laugh at images of violence inflicted on women's bodies. Reversible and impermanent violence is, of course, a trope of slapstick knockabout. But what's interesting about this film is how the violence that Mary Jane experiences does kind of become permanent, how it marks her physically even while she continues to survive it in various ways. So along these lines, this film really demonstrates how women's bodies could be used as kind of sounding boards for experimenting with new visual techniques in film narration. How Mary Jane's own bodily eruption and dismemberment really provides the thread for tying together the discontinuous images and locations depicted in this 1903 short trick film, the discontinuous images across narrative time and space. And the film stars the actress Laura Bailey, who is the wife of the filmmaker George Albert Smith. And Bailey appeared in a number of Smith's early comic and trick films, including The Old Maid's Valentine, Hanging Out the Clothes, A Kiss in the Tunnel, and The X-Ray Fiend. And Mary Jane's character, the kind of slattern or slovenly maid, was adapted from the Irish maid character Bridget, who appeared in dozens and dozens of American early comic films. In the 1903 biograph film, A Shocking Incident, the Irish maid Bridget gets electrocuted by a battery-wired turkey while she's attempting to prepare dinner. And in How Bridget Made the Fire, which is sort of similar to Mary Jane, Bridget also spontaneously combusts while lighting a fire, though the film doesn't go so far as to represent her explosion out of the chimney, as Mary Jane's mishap does. And just as a very interesting side note, there were actually numerous incidents in Britain and in the United States in the mid to late 19th century of women actually spontaneously catching fire while doing housework in their homes or in their employers' homes, and then dying from injuries sustained during the incineration. And this was due to the incredibly bulky, flammable crinoline hoop dresses, which easily caught flame against like an errant spark from the fire. And journalists at the time wryly referred to these catastrophic incidents as crinoline conflagrations. So Mary Jane's mishap does kind of stem from a history of comic discourses addressing actual instances of horrific violence afflicting women. So on a lighter note, the last of the BFI films is a comedy about militant suffragettes who are publicly beaten and humiliated in London as part of a new Parliament crackdown on women's political activism. For example, women are put in the stocks and publicly ridiculed for the misdemeanor of pestering cabinet ministers. Oddly, they're forced to cross-dress in trousers for 6 weeks as punishment for blowing up mailboxes. And the penalty for going on hunger strike in prison is to be tied to a chair and then ducked repeatedly into a pond. So this film in question is titled Milling the Militants, A Comical Absurdity, and it was produced in 1913 by the Clarendon Company and directed by the company's founder, Percy Stowe, who made over 250 short films for Clarendon between 1904 and 1915, including A Glass of Goat's Milk, a comic cautionary tale about the dangers of drinking goat's milk, and The Invaders, about a foreign invasion that is averted thanks to a carrier pigeon. So given the whimsical and absurdist tendencies of Stowe's filmmaking, some critics have argued that Milling the Militants represents a satire about the grotesque extremes of anti-suffragette rhetoric. And indeed, the horrific scenarios in the film are kind of bracketed as the dream sequence of one kind of badgered, tormented husband of a militant suffragette. But whether we can really draw any hard and fast distinctions between mobilizing repressive comic violence against women and satirizing the very gesture of doing so is, I think, something we'll have to judge for ourselves during the screening. So the final film in our first program, which will actually play third, is an American comedy from 1907 titled Laughing Gas, which comes to us today from the Harvard Film Archive. Not to be confused with Charlie Chaplin's 1914 Keystone version of Laughing Gas, this 1907 comedy by Edwin S. Porter is notable for the intersections that it stages between the gender and racial politics of laughter. In the film, an African-American woman named Mandy Brown, played by Bertha Regustus, is given nitrous oxide or laughing gas by her dentist while having her tooth extracted. Her laughter immediately becomes contagious, spreading to her white dentist and his assistant, as well as to numerous passengers on a tram car, several police officers, and a justice of the peace. Whether her out-of-control laughter gets, in a sense, ghettoized in the final scene when she partakes in the religious ecstasy of an all-black gospel service is also a question to keep in mind while viewing this film. And not much is known at all about the amazing actress who plays Mandy, Bertha Regustus. This is her only screen credit, and I've done quite a bit of digging, as have others, and found very little material about her. So if you know anything more about Bertha Regustus and her life or career, please talk to me after the screening, because I'd be really interested to know. And just as a final note before we begin the first program, I want to say a few words about some of these films' original contexts of exhibition. Early films, especially prior to the Nickelodeon boom around 1905 to 1907, were exhibited in a vast range of venues. They played in vaudeville theaters and music halls. They played at fairgrounds and carnivals, in churches and schools, at YMCA clubs, or in traveling shows, and always with live lecturers, piano players, organists, or some kind of live audio accompaniment. And there were really no normalized protocols for spectatorship across all of these venues, especially in the very early years. Spectators might get up and just marvel at the technological wonders of the film projector itself, of the machine itself, as much as they would sit in their seats and stare up at the screen. So early film spectators were emphatically embodied film spectators. And I think it's unclear whether we're given the same room to experience our own corporeal reactions as film audiences today to the kind of same extent. Just as a thought experiment, since laughter is really all about the body and bodily release, I wonder whether we might be able to have a kind of thread today about our own experiences as laughing film spectators, right? As living bodies in the audience watching these films during these screenings. And these films are just teeming with corporeal solicitations and addresses to the body, both liberating and delightful scenarios, as well as moments when our laughter might really just be a release of our palpable discomfort with the images we're watching as much as anything else. So my point being, after some dramatic suspense with my navigating these papers, my point being we're all laughing spectators today, and it would be great if we could have a running conversation throughout the afternoon about what precisely that means. So on that note, enjoy, and please join me in thanking our pianist, Laura Silderberg. It's always interesting which parts people find funny, over 100 years later. So if no one's too traumatized from the first 4 screenings, we'll move on to part 2 of the programming. And again, all of the 4 following films come from the Desmet collection of the Film Institute in the Netherlands. So we have coming up 2 short French comedies about mysticism and technology and their effects on the female body, followed by an Italian military satire about cross-dressing, and then a slightly longer German film, longer being approximately 39 minutes, about a garrison of Prussian military officers who become obsessed with the proprietor of a woman's hat shop. So the first film on deck is a French comedy by Pathé Frères from 1911 titled Rosalie and Her Phonograph. And it features the internationally famous French slapstick comedienne Sarah Duhamel, who appeared as this title character Rosalie in over 35 films between 1911 and 1912. David Robinson, the film critic, not the basketball player, once described Sarah Duhamel as like a Gaelic Marie Dressler. So in other words, she has quite a robust physique, which she wields to great comic effect. And she's simultaneously extremely accident-prone and basically physically indestructible. So in one film, she falls through the floorboard. She falls through the floorboard of her house while attempting to dust under the rug and, goes through all 3 floors. And in another film, she accidentally waylays an equestrian derby onto the railroad tracks and then somehow ends up becoming herself a champion horse jockey. So in the film we'll see today, Rosalie experiences the visceral effects of a newly purchased phonograph machine on her everyday domestic routine and embodiment. And it's a trick film, a quite delightful trick film. And after that, the comedy will get just a little bit darker again. Kunegund fait du spiritisme, or Kunegund practices spiritualism, is all about the violent consequences of investing in something that at some level you believe to be untrue. So it's from a French comic series produced by the Lux Company, and the identity of the actress who plays Kunegund remains completely unknown, even though she appeared in something like 24 titles between 1911 and 1913. And again, she remains unknown through no lack of archival digging on the part of archivists like Marianne Lewinsky and Elif Rongen-Kainaki. And the title character Kunegund's name, of course, comes from Voltaire's Candide. Kunegund is Candide's serially prostituted first cousin and love interest, and the name Kunegund itself is a pun on the French and Latin terms for female genitalia. And the film character Kunegund does not fare much better than Candide's character. In this film, she's victimized by a gang of mean-spirited schoolchildren who convince her that her apartment has been haunted by undead spirits. Kunegund is a rubish and superstitious character who's frequently made the butt of the joke, though usually in ways that cause as least as much destruction and violence for her tormentors as it does for herself. So she's always throwing the joke back on the laughing subject. The last of the short films is a military farce from 1913 produced by the Italian Cinese company titled Leia and Kri Kri in the Military. And this character, Leia, who's played by the Italian socialist activist Leia Junkie, appeared in over 40 films between 1911 and 1914. In one episode of the Leia series, Leia destroys her parents' house. She stays home to do some knitting, and she destroys her parents' house in searching for her missing ball of yarn, which the spectator notices is actually attached to the back of her skirt the whole time. So we see the ball of wool in the frame while she's basically tearing her parents' house to pieces. And in this film, Leia's effete husband, Kri Kri, who is also a popular comic series character, gets himself enlisted in the Italian military, so Leia must cross-dress as a soldier in order to avoid being separated from him. The last film is another military satire. It was released in Germany in May 1914, just a month before the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand that precipitated the conflicts leading to World War I. And do folks know the Pickelhaube spiked helmet? The helmet with the large metal spike on top that was quickly retired early into the war because a large spike atop one's head is not exactly optimal for trench warfare tactics. So this film, Maison de Fifi, is somewhat prophetic in that it depicts ornate hat accessories as the ruin of the Prussian military. It's about a garrison of military officers who are all more obsessed with collecting women's hat commodities than they are with devising military strategy. And much of the action itself takes place in a ladies' dress shop, which is the House of Fifi. So the German comedienne who plays Fifi is named Wanda Treumann, and she actually worked most prolifically as a film producer. She oversaw something like 80 titles between 1912 and 1922, and she co-founded a very successful film production company, Treumann Larsen Film GmbH, along with her husband Carl Treumann and the Danish film director Viggo Larsen. And Wanda also appeared in about 20 film roles herself, most typically as like an amorous shop girl or, an upwardly mobile secretary in bourgeois comedies of manners. And most of Treumann's humor is situational. In Das Teufelchen, or The Lady Imp, she plays a typist who marries for money, but who's then caught on camera, secret camera, cavorting with a handsome artist at a costume ball, while herself dressed as a she-devil. And in Maison de Fifi, Wanda plays an entrepreneur who opens up a ladies' dress shop in a garrison town, herself flirting with Prussian soldiers in order to seduce them into buying expensive gifts for their own wives. So it's a comedy that's really about commodification and its effects on patriarchal tradition. In another film called Wanda's Trick, Wanda wins the lottery and then raffles off her own hand in marriage as a corporate gimmick to seek a promotion within her own company. So comedy is really always part of an economy in Troyman's films. She uses laughter, the kind of comedy provoked through humorous misunderstandings, to negotiate the risks involved in wagering one's own body within a capitalist system of exchange. And this plays out with very interesting consequences in Maison de Fifi, but I don't want to spoil any of the surprises. So that said, please enjoy the second part of the program and stick around afterwards for an in-depth discussion and Q&A with our three expert panelists who are all here, Laura Horak, Denise McKenna, and Alice Maurice. Thank you. Great, so we have about 20 minutes for questions, questions from the audience, and we're very lucky to have Laura Horak, Denise McKenna, and Alice Maurice with us today to unpack a little bit of what we've just seen, which I can imagine felt slightly mystifying and perhaps disturbing at times. One place where I wanted to start, just drawing on all of your historical expertise about the context of the thematic context of the film as well as their context of production, has to do with something you and I were emailing about last summer, Denise, about how sometimes when we show early film comedies to present-day spectators, a little bit of the humorous content can feel alienating, and it doesn't necessarily always provoke laughter. It might provoke the opposite of laughter. And I would just either, I was wondering if there's anything that struck you in particular during these screenings, images that maybe have acquired humor with age that we're laughing at against the grain, or in references or jokes that you noticed from your profound knowledge of this period that you think folks in the audience might have missed. I'd love to hear you riff on that.
I guess I'll start. As for the students, I think that some of it has to do with reading the context, if not just the historical context, but also just reading the sort of sartorial codes, right? What does a maid mean? So relating to that kind of class structure, I think, is alien to a lot of contemporary students. And so they don't read the inversions or the subversions, or they don't see the humor in those interactions. Boxing cats are still funny, because I just showed that in class, and it's like YouTube for the, the turn of the century. So they like the boxing cats. But I think it does have to do with sort of reading those kinds of everyday codes sometimes. And also there's a discomfort with some things that weren't uncomfortable at the time. So Mandy is, charming and draws you in, but I think it also, there's an element of discomfort that you get to a certain point with Mandy's hysteria and the sort of relentless spectacle of that, her reaction to the laughing gas. And so students are also uncomfortable in ways that they can't, they respond to it also as historical documents. So there's this kind of aura about them that's a little like, am I supposed to laugh? What's that question? So I think that has to do, that's some of it.
Sure, I can add some things. So in general, I look at cross-dressing and cross-dressing women in my research. And something that certainly would have been, well, there's sort of two things that I think are important to think about when watching these films. One is that, particularly in the British context, there was, this well, and everywhere. There's this tremendously active, feminist movement and women taking to the streets, and particularly in Britain, doing these really kind of radical things, as they are referencing here: hunger strikes, blowing things up, setting things on fire. And there was a lot of newsreels about this, so that in a sort of factual reporting way, these things were in front of people all the time. So this would have already been a figure that people had a lot of feelings about. Fascination, fear, anxiety, interest, inspiration. So I think in that way, films like Millie and the Militants are they're almost like, the Jon Stewart of this time, like riffing on this news story, this topical news story, in a way that it doesn't feel the same today. Also, I think, and I think your work has made me think more about this too, that the sorts of clothes that women were expected to wear are just so different from what anyone wears today, really, particularly with corsets, and they're very heavy, and just sort of what that feels like to go around in the world like that compared to, say, pants or looser type, bloomers. So I think that most of the time when you see cross-dressing Millie the Militants is really, I think, unusual, where the women are like embarrassed, and it's sort of this humiliating thing to be wearing pants. Mm-hmm. Almost every film, women are like, yay, this is amazing, so great, I love this, and they dance around, so I think this is also part of this embodied experience that we don't have today.
Yeah, and just picking up on what Denise was saying, about the kind of discomfort we might feel with some of the racial and ethnic humor that was sort of pervasive in all of these early films. You look at something like Mandy, and you think about the racial politics and the kind of sort of racial hierarchies that are in play there, and it makes us uncomfortable at times. But there are other ways that that we sort of react to these things differently, in that we sometimes miss what the humor even is, because we don't have the same context of ethnic and racial humor that existed in the early 20th century. We might not even be aware of some of the stereotypes anymore, such that if you see someone on screen that has a certain kind of mustache, the audiences at the time might immediately recognize that person as Irish or German or Swedish, right? They're all these figures that were particular ethnic types that we don't even necessarily recognize today. And so sometimes we're missing that level of humor, even if it's not disturbing. It might not look racist. It just looks like nothing to us. It just looks like a couple of guys on the street. And so I think you saw that in the Mandy film as well, different types, ethnic types that she ran into as she went along. And so sometimes that sort of thing is not just disturbing, but just sort of not really legible for us anymore.
Or to add to that, reading class boundaries and transgressing class boundaries also, you're just not going to see it in the same way, or if at all.
So we don't have a ton of time left. I wanted to open up the Q&A to the audience if anyone has any questions for the panelists.
Hi, my name is George Saad from Toronto Film School. My question is basically, most of the videos you see from the background, the art director, it's kind of the rich class. So what they're kind of tackling the rich class, because most of the background is kind of from the rich class. As you can see from design, everything except for one clip, which is with the chimney. So are these kind of tackling middle class society or upper class when it comes to humor and being sarcastic in a way? That's my question.
Oh, I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a way in which there's a great deal of pleasure taken in taking down those kinds of middle class couples. I think the Daisy Doodad, right? The sort of silliness of that, and part of the pleasure of seeing them get their comeuppance in a way is I think has to do with class politics. Also, did anybody else notice that that's like Bill Clinton's twin? Like
her husband.
This is actually mentioned on the BFI website. Right up with the film. Yeah. He looks uncannily like Bill Clinton.
Yeah, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. So then it reads as this whole Bill Hillary thing. Talk about rereading comedy in a different context. It's like, so.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for an interesting screening. Just a question about the humor of direct address to the camera. And it struck me in this screening, especially with the early films, and also with a lot of contemporary comedy. I've been watching Parks and Recreation lately, and April Ludgate's direct address to the camera is often the funniest, very subtle moments. I'm just wondering, within the comedic styles of the period, if there was a gendered element to direct address in which female comedians were read differently or acted differently, or there were different patterns of acting compared to the male actors.
That's a tough one because direct address, sort of the frontal mode of address, is really prevalent, particularly in the earlier films where they're almost entirely the earlier films, the pre-1905 films, for example, and films that are sort of unfold over a single shot or at least within a single frame, a kind of static frame. You see that, across the board, that kind of frontal mode of address. So the question of whether that's gendered, what it makes me think of is the look out to the audience. It can be a kind of role reversal for the women in these films, particularly since so many early films were about titillation and about peeping at women. And so a lot of the times they might be, undressing behind a window shade, or men might be gawking at women as they walk by. And then you'll see a lot of films that then kind of turn the tables on that kind of peeping relationship. And a number of those films feature women kind of winking to the audience or reaching out to the audience. And when you think about the fact that so many of the spectators would have been men in so many of these contexts, there's a real charge to women kind of taking the reins or really making overt gestures toward the audience in some of these earlier films. I wouldn't say that it's that there's more women doing it, but definitely I think there is a gendered element to it for sure.
I would just add one thing. As far as cross-dressing films where men dress up like women and women dress up like men, it's really common for both of them to look at the audience and kind of share, you and I know the truth and these people don't. And then I would just add something that strikes me about these films and other films like them is these close-ups that you have at the beginning or the end that really seems like film showing off what it can do that you can't do in theater. You can inspect these like really fascinating, strange, funny faces in a way that no other, as they move, in a way that no other medium would let you do that.
Yeah, I think What Happened on 23rd Street is another good example. And it's an early film in which a woman's walking down the street and her skirt blows up. Her skirt gets blown up by the wind. So, it becomes about like objectification and public exposure. But then at the end of the film, the woman who's just been exposed kind of winks at the spectator. So the direct address of the woman winking back at the camera, which is a trope, that men and women both do in early cinema, can become a way of sort of reappropriating the gaze. And that creates a little bit of tension between scenes of objectification and voyeurism and some kind of counter address from the woman. But just, Mike, when you mentioned April Ludgate, I feel like Fifi is almost, in Maison de Fifi is almost April Ludgate's like German pre-World War I sister. It's a really different kind of direct address to the spectator. It's more of an ironic aside, and it's almost a form of spectator positioning. The way in these like reality TV comedies like The Office or Parks and Rec, the actor kind of having a strong facial reaction to an absurd scenario stands in for the laugh track, because the laugh track has sort of become obsolete in the sitcom. And I think, we don't hear people laugh in these movies. Alice, we were emailing yesterday, Alice pointed this out. So in a way, the woman winking at the spectator is like the missing laugh track of silent cinema.
Hello, Arlene. My name is Arlene. I'm a student at the Toronto Film School. I have one question in regards with Mandy. When it comes to the laughing, how was it presented? Because I'm watching it as a person of color, and I see a different type of light. I see her speaking, using the camera to speak liberation, though she is a servant. It just, is that how I'm supposed to interpret it? Because I'm seeing it in that type of viewing. Is that how the director want to present it? That she can enforce liberation just by her laughter? Or am I taking that to the next level?
Well, that film, many people have puzzled over it. And people typically will sort of propose one reading that is kind of more in line with what you're saying, that there's this real power to Mandy, and the fact that she's so unusual in the history of early cinema in terms of an African-American woman being treated as her own agent, that she's not simply there as, the maid who's just helping the white woman's plot go along and her story. She's the agent, she's the subject, she's traversing so freely, right, through so many different scenes. I mean, her body essentially connects all of those static frames that we see as she, encounters this different groups, right? And encountering so many different ethnic groups, different forms of whites, authority figures, law, and she just seems to traverse so freely through these public spaces. So it's very unusual in early cinema to see a figure like that. And so some people have read it as, well, despite the stereotypes within which she exists, she's still this kind of figure of power, and also that she's spreading harmony somehow, that she's not actually seen as, unlike Daisy Doodad, who's arrested and seen as a threat. Everywhere she goes, Mandy spreads mirth, right? And a kind of laughter that just seems to be contagious laughter. It doesn't seem to be people simply laughing at her. It really does seem to be a kind of contagion that brings all peoples together, if you will. So I think there has been a reading that's kind of focusing more on her freedom and liberation. At the same time, people usually temper it with, but it's still unfolding within these stereotypes. It's still taking advantage of the Black domestic kind of mammy figure, if you will. It's drawing on some of those in terms of her physical type and the kinds of things that are going on with the broad comedy. And obviously that the ending that she returns back to a segregated space. I'll add another dimension that I think we should think about, getting back to sound, and the fact that we don't know what kinds of sounds were accompanying this film in the various contexts in which it would have been shown. But there is this laughter, right? And the audience laughter would certainly fill in for the silent laughter. But another thing we might want to think about is the kind of context of Black laughter and how it was commodified at the end of the 19th and early 20th century in race records, so that George Johnson, one of the first known African-American recording artists, his big hit in the late 1890s was the Laughing Song, which featured him singing lyrics. It was a race record, and he would sing these lyrics, and then he would laugh. Sort of the chorus would just be him laughing. And he recorded it and re-recorded it many different times. Other people imitated it. It was a huge bestseller. So I wonder if we should also think about the Laughing Gas film in the context of those records and their popularity. Those records were typically popularly characterized as contagious, as rhythmic, as a kind of special kind of merry laughter from this kind of African-American male who was laughing. So where does Mandy fit in there? Would that have been the context that they would have been capitalizing upon with that film? But then what do you do that now it's a female who's laughing? And so it puts it in a different category. So I think, you kind of end up kind of being forced into a kind of ambivalence because we don't know so much about that performer and about the context. But I don't think it's wrong to say, because it is such an unusual image, and it's really compelling. It's really compelling to see her just kind of traipsing about and wreaking all this havoc. Yeah.
Oh, sure. Sorry. Thank you. My question is really not about the text of the films, but I was very curious about the music, and maybe you could comment on that. The music seemed to be improvised or kind of reacted to the pianist was reacting to the images, not really looking at a chart. Would there have been specific music written at the time for each of these films, or was it improvised by the pianist at the time?
I mean, I think usually improvised.
It wasn't until later on that they would write scores for films in the, late teens, early 20s?
Yeah. And it depended on the context of exhibition, of course, whether it's in a vaudeville theater or in the sort of the class status of the exhibition venue. There might be a full orchestra for some of the screenings, and at others, maybe an organ player.
And there might have been sound effects. There might have been all kinds of things because just the contingencies of the exhibition context would mean that what the film would have been paired with would have been different. What the slate would have been different, and there might have been all kinds of sounds produced to kind of add to the comedy of the piece.
Sorry, just a quick follow-up. Could you contextualize just time-wise where this might fit into films like Fritz Lang's Napoleon, for instance, where there was a very detailed symphonic score and things like that? Where in terms of timeline was this? Sorry, Chris.
I don't know, bro.
Well, so Gantz's Napoleon is, 1927, and these films were all 1903 to 1914.
It's interesting. Films dealt with a lot of strong themes and so on, but in a lighter sense, using comedy and so on. Do you think audiences were more willing to digest these themes in that arena as opposed to, like, say, the Lois Weber films or things like that dealt with it head on or so on?
Comedy makes the pill go down.
For sure.
I mean, I think it still does, so.
Although I think there were huge numbers of melodramas dealing with these kind of topical and difficult issues. So I think that all genres were kind of wrestling with some of these issues.
Yeah, they seem to fall out of favor, though. Sorry, yeah. That's what this is, right? They say, or at least I get the sense that the melodramas sort of fell out of favor after a while, and the comedies continued to march on. Or no? Am I wrong on that?
I mean, I think melodrama remains to be a really vital form for dealing with injustice, say. I'm trying to think of some recent films, but I think it's, while, say, Lois Weber kind of explicitly political, I'm going to, send a message and convince you with this sort of harrowing tale, may have fallen out of favor, but sort of slightly less obviously kind of directed, but still films with messages about how the social world should be using melodrama, I think, have always been popular. But
I think the images of violence inflicted on women's bodies really went out of fashion in around the 19-teens. I mean, the program cut off around 1914 for a reason, and you get like the Keystone comedy bathing beauties, women modeling bathing suits, or the commodification of female stardom. I mean, it means something very different for women, especially conventionally attractive women, to appear in slapstick films, heading into the classical period, late teens, early 20s, than it did during this period. And that's part of what makes these films so interesting, I think. And our laughter so ambivalent. Yes.
Yeah, no, the ambivalence, I think that's also the question of the line between exploitation and message, especially for some of these early films, like the suffragettes who get dunked in the pond like they're witches of old, right? So there's some of that discomfort that we still have with comedians who blur those boundaries. But.
Yeah, I mean, there's a way in which these films a number of the ones that were shown are kind of liminal in the sense that they're borderline between sort of still using the modes of earlier motion pictures, the direct address, the sort of, frontally directed gags and moments that are very seem almost anti-narrative, that are kind of more anarchic, while also being on the brink of what's coming, which is the rise of the feature films, the more classical style. And so you see that they're kind of pulling from a grab bag of performance styles and modes of address and film language.
I also think with the rise of the star system, it becomes very infrequent to have a leading lady who's allowed to look ugly. Whereas you get some character actresses and stuff, but here, that's not the prohibition that it becomes.
I was wondering,
Hi, first of all, I'd like to say that was an absolutely fantastic program. I really loved it. And I think I still have a lot of questions actually about Mandy's film, because I think she really, really holds a lot of ambivalence, which a lot of the other films did as well. But maybe some of the questions that I have are things like, how are you measuring the popularity of the film at that time? Do you have any information as to whether it was shown to quote unquote Black audiences and Black areas? Were there other, I don't know, I have a lot of questions, so you don't have to answer any of them, but just like food for thought, I guess. Just things that also made me wonder, were there Black communities in Europe that were producing films similar to that? And I know that like the Lumiere brothers had gone to Africa early on, but the kinds of films that were coming out of the African continent were completely different than that. And I don't know, just if we could talk a little bit about representation and maybe how the Black audience was also receiving it at the time would be something interesting for me.
Well, so yeah, I think that for much of the time that we're looking at, you have some early Black filmmakers in the U.S. Trying to make films up during this period. Some of the earliest happen in the teens, and then you'll get Oscar Michaud and others in the kind of late teens, early 20s, producing race films, if you will. That is, films that are made with a Black audience in mind, as opposed to something like Laughing Gas and other films of this period that would have been seen by Black audiences, but were not made with a Black audience in mind. Okay, it's obviously a kind of a crucial difference, but of course, that's not to say that, again, that's one of the contingencies of the exhibition context, right? Where it was shown, how it was received, such that there are many films that were made not at all with mainstream films that weren't made at all with Black audiences in mind, but that when you look at where they were shown, there were a number of segregated movie theaters and movie theaters that were in Black neighborhoods or parts of the city. So that you read the records of those accounts and you see that as you might expect, films are read differently by different audiences. Just as we were talking about whether you read Mandy as a kind of liberation figure or as a stereotype, you might see accounts where the newspapers and the Black press would point to the fact that, hey, this African-American performer is being featured in this movie, even if it might have been a small role. Or that, later in the early sound films, if jazz and blues musicians were being used in the film, that would be promoted that way, to Black audiences and within the Black press. So absolutely the kind of meaning of these films, regardless of how they were intended or what audiences were being thought of, the meaning of the film certainly changed and shifted according to where they were screened. So these early films like Laughing Gas, not really thinking about Black audiences, but would certainly have reached Black audiences.
A lot of the films themselves really play on the uncertainty of address, the uncertainty about who the spectator is. I think Laughing Gas is a kind of limit case within this sort of genre, but there's another film from around the same time called Nellie the Beautiful Housemaid. And Mandy's full name is Mandy Brown in this film. In Nellie the Beautiful Housemaid, her name is Nellie White. And it's, the use of racial stereotyping as a sight gag. There are 2 or 3 like old fogey white men who are looking for, a young, attractive, white, beautiful housemaid. And they get a response from Nellie White, who's another mammy figure. But the kind of conceal and reveal at the end is that she shows up and it's just that her last name is White. So a lot of the ways in which these films thematize the sort of uncertainty of who's in the frame, who's being addressed beyond the frame might give us clues to these kinds of absent histories about spectatorship, who was watching them, who are they made for.
Yeah, and the presence of so many ethnic and racial stereotypes, while at the same time there being all of these cues that the audience expected would have been from this or that ethnic group, or from certain areas in cities that might have been populated by a number of immigrants, and so the fact that these things kind of coexist, this seemingly hegemonic use of stereotypes, while also addressing and peppering films with cues for sort of particular kinds of audiences that included immigrants and various ethnicities and races.
Other questions? How much time do we have left? One more? I have a question if no one else does. One thing I'm obsessed with that we really see in all of these screenings is a sort of blurring or collapse between public and private spheres, or between civic discourses and state institutions. And I mean, in Mary Jane's Mishap, she literally explodes out of the chimney onto the public sphere. Or Daisy Doodad's Dial, she's haunted by the kind of ambivalence about her own public face-making, the ambivalence that her face-making provokes in public that actually infiltrates the space of her bedroom. And, we see Prussian military officers kind of invading Fifi's own boudoir. So there's a real sense in which comedy is enlisted in these films. Talk about ambivalence to sort of negotiate the collapse between gendered public and private spheres, as well as between civic discourse and state institutions. So I was wondering if this sparks any thoughts for our panelists.
I guess Daisy is the most, well, she sticks with me the most. Sorry, Daisy is the most evocative in a way because of, I guess, the dream at the end is the tell, but it's also her, in a sense, her punishment for banning the husband from the bedroom, right? So there's that patriarchal, private, public relations being worked out within the home as they negotiate their competition and sort of the competitive space of the domestic. Again, in the Militants as well, it's the private, public, where are the divides anymore? And it's about a discourse of power, I think, which is most clear when Daisy's put in the jail cell and she's making those faces through the window. Where you're like, okay, now that the rebellion of the face makes even more sense in a way. Did anybody else make faces at Mandy or Daisy as you're trying to mimic the face? I mean, how you're talking about the corpore? No, I can't. I realized I couldn't. But you asked about the corporeality of the experience of laughter at the beginning. To go back to your initial question as well, about how one responds bodily, and we still respond bodily. Like Daisy still has the power to.
Yeah, and I think that's. I think the film certainly intends that to happen. That, if we could say it intends anything these days, I think you're supposed to walk out of the theater making faces and trying it out. I mean, you could see that even when she's banned him from the bedroom, he's involuntarily making faces, right? So it's already kind of caught up to him. It's sort of lasted as a contagion. But that made me think of discourses around the close-up. The close-up that we all accept nowadays in the transitional period of the early 1900s. The close-up was a controversy. People reacted badly to it often. So what is it with these big faces on screen? It's sort of interrupting the story, and or the more kind of exaggerated acting style would look weird and funny the closer the framing was. And so a lot of commentators really had a lot to say about the close-up and as either ridiculous or grotesque, et cetera. And so that made me think about her face. And one of the things commentators would say is that, oh, you've got people in the audience making faces because of how silly the big faces look on screen. And so it's this moment where you kind of take that and you run with it and you kind of make it in kind of anarchic way of having the audience respond bodily to the film, and not just in a kind of restrained, quiet kind of way that would be expected of later films.
I'm being reminded by my co-organizer not to forget to mention this afternoon's event, which is a Toronto Film and Media Seminar panel at 4:30, featuring all of the panelists on stage now, where we'll continue to unpack some of the questions raised during the screenings. So unfortunately, I think we are about out of time right now, but please join us for the panel at 4:30. It's going to be upstairs, and please join me in thanking all of our panelists and Laura Silverman on the panel.